in the gentle twilight of memory, where history dissolves into legend and legend breathes with the rhythm of eternal truth. There exists a story that has echoed through 25 centuries of human consciousness. It is a tale written not merely in the annals of scholars, but in the very foundations of how we understand courage, freedom, and the eternal dance between East and West. Picture, if you will, the Mediterranean world of the 5th century before Christ, a realm where olive groves caught the first light of dawn, where marble columns stood sentinel against the passage of time, and where the wine-dark sea carried both merchants and dreams across horizons that seemed to stretch into infinity. Here, in this ancient theatre of human ambition, two great civilizations would meet in a confrontation that would determine not merely the fate of armies, but the very trajectory of Western thought. Tonight, we journey together through this timeless landscape, where the whisper of wind through Greek olive branches mingles with the distant echo of Persian war drums, and where the eternal questions of human nature, questions we still ponder in our own restless age, first crystallized into their purest form. To understand the collision that would shake the ancient world, we must first comprehend the profound differences in the souls of two great peoples. Differences as fundamental as the landscapes that shaped their earliest dreams. In the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved their ancient channels through earth that had witnessed the birth of civilization itself, there arose a culture that embraced the vastness of imperial unity. Here, beneath skies that seemed to stretch without limit across endless plains, the Persian spirit learned to think in terms of synthesis, of bringing together the scattered fragments of humanity under one great and encompassing order. The morning light that fell upon Persepolis illuminated not merely a capital city, but a philosophical statement carved in stone, a declaration that diversity could flourish under the protective embrace of imperial tolerance. In the great audience halls where representatives from 100 nations gathered, their varied languages and customs forming a symphony of human difference, the Persian genius revealed itself. The capacity to govern not through uniformity, but through the careful orchestration of magnificent diversity. Contrast this with the rocky peninsulas and scattered islands of the Greek world, where geography itself seemed to whisper lessons of independence and self-reliance. In the crystalline light that danced across the Aegean, where every island stood as a world unto itself, and every mountain valley harbored its own fierce identity, a different human spirit took shape. Here, in the marble-white clarity of Athenian mornings, where citizens gathered in the agora to debate the very nature of justice and truth, the concept of the polis, the city-state, emerged as something sacred, something worth dying for. The Greek genius manifested not in the coordination of vast territories, but in the intensive cultivation of civic virtue within small, manageable communities. Where Persians spoke of the king as the earthly reflection of divine order, Greeks explored the revolutionary possibility that ordinary men might govern themselves through reason and debate. In the shade of plane trees where philosophers gathered, in the torch-lit assemblies where citizens argued late into the night, a new form of human consciousness was being born, one that would prove as unyielding as the marble from which they carved their gods. These were not merely political differences, but profound spiritual orientations that would make peaceful coexistence impossible. The Persian embrace of hierarchical harmony, where each people contributed their unique gifts to the greater imperial tapestry, stood in fundamental opposition to the Greek insistence on autonomy, on the right of each polis to determine its own destiny according to its own understanding of divine will and human nature. As merchants traveled the ancient roads that connected these two worlds, carrying not only goods but ideas, customs, and rumors, the tension between these incompatible visions grew like a storm gathering on the horizon. In Persian courts, Greek independence appeared as dangerous chaos, a rejection of the divine order that kept the world in balance. In Greek assemblies, Persian authority seemed the very negation of human dignity, a reduction of free men to the status of slaves. The stage was set for a conflict that would be far more than a contest of armies. It would be a collision of worldviews, a testing of two radically different answers to the fundamental questions of how human beings should live together on this earth. And as the sun set over both the Persian capitals and the Greek cities, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward each other across the gathering darkness, the ancient world held its breath, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold from the wind-swept plateau of Persia, where the harsh beauty of mountain and desert had forged a people capable of extraordinary endurance. There emerged in the 6th century a ruler whose vision would reshape the very concept of empire. Cyrus the Great was not merely a conqueror, he was a revolutionary, a man who understood that lasting power could not be built on fear alone, but required something far more sophisticated, the willing cooperation of the governed. The genius of Cyrus lay not in his military prowess, though that was considerable, but in his profound psychological insight into the nature of human loyalty. Where previous empires had ruled through the brutal suppression of local customs and the imposition of alien gods, Cyrus offered something unprecedented, the possibility of unity without uniformity, of imperial greatness achieved through the celebration rather than the destruction of diversity. Picture the great audience hall at Persepolis, where the morning light streaming through high windows illuminated a scene that would have been impossible in any previous age. Here, representatives from dozens of nations, Babylonians with their star charts and cylinder seals, Egyptians with their profound mysteries of the afterlife, Greeks with their philosophical debates, nomads from the steppes with their tales of endless horizons, all gathered not as conquered subjects, but as participants in a grand imperial symphony. The Persian administrative system, with its network of satrapies stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, represented a masterpiece of organizational genius. Along the royal road, that marvel of ancient engineering that connected Sardis to Susa across 1,500 miles of diverse terrain, mounted messengers carried the imperial word with a speed and efficiency that would not be matched for centuries. The Persian postal system, with its relay stations and carefully maintained routes, enabled communication across distances that had previously made unified government impossible. Yet this was not merely a matter of roads and relay stations. The Persian genius lay in understanding that an empire of such vast scale could only be held together by respecting the deepest spiritual needs of its diverse peoples. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he did not impose Persian gods upon the conquered city. Instead, he restored the local deities to their temples and allowed exiled peoples to return to their ancestral lands. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, with its declaration of religious tolerance and its promise to restore displaced peoples, represented not weakness but the highest form of imperial wisdom. This policy of cultural accommodation created a profound psychological bond between ruler and ruled. The Persian king was not seen as a foreign tyrant, but as the earthly representative of divine order, the guarantor of each people's right to worship their own gods and maintain their own customs within the greater imperial framework. The Persian formula for empire unity in diversity, strength through accommodation, created a stability that would endure for more than 2 centuries. As the Persian Empire expanded westward, absorbing the Greek cities of Ionia along the Aegean coast, this fundamental difference in governing philosophy would create the first sparks of the greater conflict to come. The Ionian Greeks, accustomed to the fierce independence of the polis system, found themselves subjects of an empire that offered them prosperity and protection in exchange for political autonomy. For many, this was an acceptable bargain, but for some, the loss of political freedom, no matter how benevolently administered, represented a fundamental violation of what it meant to be Greek. The Persian advance into Europe, with the conquest of Thrace and the submission of Macedonia, brought the empire to the very doorstep of the Greek mainland. Here, two incompatible visions of human organization would finally meet. The Persian dream of universal empire, of a world united under the wise rule of the great king, would collide with the Greek insistence on local autonomy, on the right of each community to determine its own destiny. As Persian administrators settled into their new territories, establishing the efficient systems of taxation and governance that had proven so successful throughout the empire, they could not have imagined that their very success would create the conditions for the greatest challenge the Persian Empire would ever face. The stage was set for a conflict that would test whether the Persian genius for accommodation could extend even to peoples who valued their independence more than their prosperity. In the marble-bright cities of Ionia, where the Aegean's azure waters lapped against harbors filled with merchant vessels from across the known world, there flourished a form of human consciousness that would prove as revolutionary as any military innovation. Here, in cities like Miletus and Ephesus, where the accumulated wisdom of the East met the restless curiosity of the Greek mind, the concept of eleutheria, freedom, took shape not merely as a political arrangement, but as a fundamental principle of human existence. The Ionian Greeks occupied a unique position in the ancient world, serving as cultural mediators between the great civilizations of the East and the emerging city-states of the Greek mainland. Their prosperity depended on trade, on the ability to move freely between the Persian Empire and the independent Greek cities, carrying not only goods but ideas, innovations, and dreams. Yet this very prosperity contained within it the seeds of a profound spiritual crisis. Under Persian rule, the Ionian cities experienced unprecedented economic growth. The Persian peace, the Pax Persica, had opened trade routes that stretched from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean, creating opportunities for wealth that previous generations could never have imagined. The harbors of Miletus bustled with Persian gold, Egyptian grain, and exotic goods from lands whose names were whispered like incantations in the marketplaces. For the merchant classes, Persian rule represented not oppression, but opportunity. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, a different kind of conversation was taking place. In the gymnasia where young men trained their bodies and minds, in the symposia where wine loosened tongues and philosophical debates continued until dawn, a growing number of Greeks began to question whether prosperity alone could satisfy the deepest needs of the human soul. The Persian system, for all its efficiency and tolerance, demanded one thing that many Greeks found increasingly difficult to give: the surrender of political autonomy. The Persian-appointed tyrants who governed the Ionian cities were often capable and even popular rulers. They maintained order, protected trade, and generally left local customs undisturbed. But they ruled by the authority of a distant king, not by the consent of their own citizens. For Greeks who had grown up with the revolutionary idea that men could govern themselves through reason and debate, this represented a fundamental violation of human dignity. In the philosophical schools of Ionia, where thinkers like Thales and Heraclitus were beginning to explore the rational principles that governed the natural world, this political subjugation took on cosmic significance. If the universe itself operated according to logos, divine reason, then surely human communities should be governed by the same principle. The Persian system, no matter how benevolent, represented a rejection of this fundamental truth. The tension between prosperity and freedom became particularly acute during the annual tribute collections, when Persian officials would arrive with their carefully maintained records and their polite but firm demands for payment. The sound of Persian gold being counted in the treasuries of Ionian cities became a constant reminder of their subordinate status. Young Greeks who had been educated in the principles of philosophy and rhetoric found themselves paying taxes to support an empire in whose governance they had no voice. As news arrived from the Greek mainland of the democratic experiments in Athens and the military achievements of the independent city-states, The contrast between Persian subjugation and Greek freedom became increasingly stark. The Ionian Greeks began to see themselves not as fortunate subjects of a benevolent empire, but as captives of a system that, however efficient, denied them their birthright as free men. The intellectual ferment of Ionia, where the first stirrings of rational philosophy were challenging traditional religious explanations of the world, created a psychological climate in which political revolution became almost inevitable. If human reason could uncover the hidden principles that governed the movements of the stars and the changing of the seasons, then surely it could also discover the proper principles for governing human communities. This awakening of political consciousness in Ionia would soon find its catalyst in the desperate schemes of ambitious individuals. But its deeper roots lay in the fundamental incompatibility between the Persian genius for imperial accommodation and the Greek insistence on local autonomy. The stage was set for a conflict that would transform a regional uprising into a clash of civilizations. In the year 499 before Christ, as the spring sun warmed the marble columns of Miletus and merchants prepared their ships for another season of profitable trade, a moment of personal desperation would ignite a conflagration that would ultimately consume both Persian and Greek dreams. Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, faced a crisis that seemed to offer only two choices: disgrace before the Persian court, or a gamble that would risk everything on the uncertain loyalty of his fellow Greeks. The immediate cause of Aristagoras' predicament lay in a failed expedition to Naxos, where Persian resources had been squandered in an unsuccessful attempt to install a friendly government. Facing the prospect of explaining this failure to Artaphernes, the Persian satrap of Sardis, Aristagoras chose instead a course of action that would transform his personal crisis into a civilizational conflict. He renounced his tyranny, proclaimed himself the leader of a free Miletus, and sent urgent messages to the Greek cities of the mainland, calling upon them to support their Ionian kinsmen in a war of liberation. The response to this call revealed the deep currents of sympathy and anxiety that connected the Greek world. In Athens, where the memory of Persian threats still haunted the political consciousness, the assembly voted to send 20 ships to support the Ionian cause. In Eretria, grateful for Milesian support in an earlier conflict, the citizens voted to send 5 additional vessels. These decisions, made in the heat of democratic debate and influenced by considerations of honor and kinship, would provide the Persian king with the justification he needed to extend his imperial ambitions to the Greek mainland. The early phases of the Ionian Revolt revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Greek political organization. The rebels' ability to coordinate simultaneous uprisings across multiple cities demonstrated the power of shared cultural identity and the effectiveness of Greek networks of communication. The swift capture of Sardis, where the rebels successfully penetrated the lower city and drove the Persian garrison to take refuge in the citadel, showed that the Persian military was not invincible when faced with determined local resistance. Yet the accidental burning of the Temple of Cybele during the assault on Sardis introduced a religious dimension to the conflict that would profoundly influence its subsequent development. The destruction of this sacred site, revered by both Persians and their Lydian subjects, transformed what had begun as a political rebellion into something approaching a holy war. The flames that consumed the temple seemed to Persian eyes to reveal the true nature of Greek civilization, not a legitimate alternative to Persian rule, but a force of chaos and sacrilege that threatened the very foundations of cosmic order. The Persian response to the revolt demonstrated the empire's remarkable resilience and organizational capacity. Despite the initial shock of the Sardis assault, Persian forces were quickly mobilized from across the empire. The counterattack, when it came, revealed the full weight of imperial resources that could be brought to bear against rebels. The decisive naval battle at Lad, where the Greek fleet dissolved in mutual recrimination and betrayal, exposed the fundamental weakness of Greek political organization, the inability to maintain unity in the face of sustained pressure. The siege and destruction of Miletus in 494 marked the effective end of the Ionian Revolt as a military enterprise, but its psychological impact would prove far more enduring. The deportation of the Milesian population to distant parts of the Persian Empire, the transformation of this once proud city into a depopulated ruin, served as a stark reminder of the price of unsuccessful rebellion. Yet for Greeks throughout the Mediterranean world, the revolt had demonstrated that Persian power was not absolute, that the empire could be challenged and, at least temporarily, defeated. The revolt's most significant consequence lay not in its military achievements, but in its revelation of the fundamental incompatibility between Persian and Greek political systems. The Persian offer of reconciliation, with its promise of restored prosperity in exchange for political submission, was rejected by enough Greeks to ensure that the conflict would continue. The Persian decision to punish Athens and Eretria for their support of the rebels guaranteed that the struggle would extend beyond Ionia to encompass the entire Greek world. As Persian forces began their methodical reduction of the remaining rebel strongholds, and as Greek refugees carried tales of both heroism and disaster to cities throughout the Aegean, the ancient world began to sense that something unprecedented was unfolding. The Ionian Revolt had not merely challenged Persian authority, it had raised questions about the nature of legitimate government that would resonate through the centuries. The stage was set for a larger conflict that would determine whether the future would belong to the Persian vision of universal empire or the Greek dream of local autonomy. On a September morning, in the year 490 before Christ, as the Attic sun cast long shadows across the plain of Marathon, 26 miles from Athens, the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance. The Persian fleet, its bronze-reinforced prows cutting through the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, had carried the imperial army to this carefully chosen landing site, where the wide plain seemed to offer ideal conditions for the deployment of Persian cavalry and the systematic destruction of Athenian resistance. The sight of the Persian fleet darkening the horizon of Marathon Bay struck terror into the hearts of those who witnessed it. Here was the material manifestation of the world's greatest empire, the accumulated might of dozens of nations serving under the banner of the great king. The ships themselves, hundreds of vessels carrying soldiers whose equipment gleamed with the wealth of continents, represented not merely military power, but the vast organizational genius that had enabled Persia to dominate the civilized world for more than half a century. Artaphernes and Datis, the Persian commanders, had planned this expedition with meticulous care. The choice of Marathon as a landing site reflected sophisticated strategic thinking. The plain was large enough to accommodate the Persian cavalry that had proven so effective in previous campaigns, yet close enough to Athens to force the Athenians to respond quickly before they could gather allies or prepare elaborate defenses. The presence of the exiled Athenian tyrant Hippias, who had guided the Persian fleet to this spot, added a legitimizing element to the invasion. The Persians could claim to be restoring rightful authority rather than imposing foreign rule. Within the marble walls of Athens, the news of the Persian landing created a crisis that tested the very foundations of the young democracy. In the assembly, where citizens gathered to debate the city's response, the fundamental questions of war and peace, courage and survival, were argued with an intensity that reflected the magnitude of the stakes. The decision to march out and meet the Persians at Marathon, rather than waiting behind the city's fortifications, represented a triumph of courage over prudence that would define the Athenian character for generations to come. The Athenian army that marched out to Marathon was a citizen militia, composed not of professional soldiers, but of ordinary men who had left their farms and workshops to defend their city. These hoplites, armed with bronze-tipped spears and circular shields, represented a military innovation that was as much philosophical as tactical. The phalanx formation, where each man's shield protected not only himself but his comrade to the left, embodied the democratic principle that the community's survival depended on the courage and dedication of each individual citizen. Miltiades, the Athenian general who would orchestrate the victory, understood that conventional tactics would lead to certain defeat. The Persian army outnumbered the Athenians by at least 2-1, and their tactical flexibility, combined with superior archery and cavalry, should have made victory impossible. Yet Miltiades possessed something that no amount of Persian gold could purchase: intimate knowledge of Persian military methods gained through years of service in the Persian Empire, and an understanding of the psychological factors that could transform numerical disadvantage into strategic opportunity. The battle itself, when it came, unfolded with a swiftness that seemed to compress eternity into a single morning. The famous Athenian charge across the plain of Marathon, where Greek hoplites ran nearly a mile under Persian arrow fire before crashing into the enemy lines, represented more than military tactics. The sound of bronze clashing against bronze, the war cries of free men advancing against imperial tyranny, the dust clouds rising beneath thousands of feet, all these elements combined to create a moment when the abstract ideals of freedom and independence were tested in the most concrete possible way. The Persian center, strengthened to receive the main Athenian assault, initially held firm, even pushing back the Greek advance. For a moment, it seemed that Persian confidence in their military superiority would be vindicated. But Miltiades had weakened his center deliberately, concentrating his strength on the wings, where the Athenian advance proved irresistible. As the Persian flanks collapsed and the Greek wings turned inward, the entire Persian formation began to disintegrate. The rout that followed was complete and devastating. Persian soldiers, accustomed to victory and confident in their superior equipment, found themselves fleeing in panic toward their ships. The Athenian pursuit, led by men who had minutes before faced what seemed like certain death, was relentless. The sight of the Persian fleet hastily departing, leaving behind their dead and wounded, their abandoned equipment glinting in the Mediterranean sun, provided a visual confirmation of what had seemed impossible. The greatest empire in the world had been defeated by a single Greek city-state. The immediate aftermath of Marathon created a legend that would inspire resistance to tyranny for centuries to come. The burial mound raised over the 102 Athenian dead, standing in eternal contrast to the thousands of Persian casualties, became a pilgrimage site where future generations would come to remember that freedom is always worth its price. The famous run of Phidippides, carrying news of victory to Athens, embodied the city's transformation from terror to triumph in a single heroic gesture. Yet Marathon's deeper significance lay not in its immediate military consequences, but in its demonstration that the Persian Empire was not invincible. The victory provided psychological proof that free men fighting for their own institutions could defeat professional armies fighting for a distant king. The tremors of this realization would spread throughout the Greek world, inspiring resistance and challenging the assumption that Persian expansion was inevitable. As news of the victory spread along the trade routes and diplomatic channels that connected the ancient world, both Greeks and Persians began to understand that Marathon had changed everything. The Persian Empire had suffered its first significant defeat, while the Greeks had discovered that their ideals of freedom and independence were not merely philosophical abstractions, but practical realities that could be defended with blood and bronze. the stage was set for a larger conflict that would determine whether the future belonged to imperial unity or local autonomy. In the royal palace at Persepolis, where the morning light filtered through columns carved with the tributaries of empire, the news of Marathon fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread throughout the ancient world. Darius, the great king whose reign had seen the empire reach its zenith, received the reports of defeat with the stoic dignity befitting his station. But the implications of the disaster were clear to all who understood the delicate psychology of imperial rule. The death of Darius in 486, before he could mount his planned expedition of revenge, transferred the burden of Persian honor to his son Xerxes, a prince whose entire education had prepared him for the maintenance of empire, but not for the restoration of damaged prestige. The young king inherited not merely the throne of the world's greatest empire, but the psychological necessity of proving that the defeat at Marathon had been an aberration, not a revelation of Persian weakness. For 4 years, from 486 to 482, the Persian Empire engaged in the most massive military preparation the ancient world had ever witnessed. The scale of the undertaking reflected not merely the desire for revenge, but the Persian understanding that the coming campaign would determine whether the empire would continue to expand or begin the slow process of decline that had consumed every great power before it. This would be total war, a mobilization of resources so complete that success would validate the Persian system for generations, while failure would shake the foundations of imperial authority. The logistical challenges of the expedition were unprecedented. The Persian army that would march against Greece represented not merely the military forces of the empire, but a cross-section of the entire Persian world. From the steppes of Central Asia came the Scythian horsemen with their deadly composite bows. From the deserts of Arabia came camel-mounted warriors who could endure conditions that would kill other men. From the mountains of Afghanistan came fighters whose ancestors had never known defeat. The coordination of these diverse forces into a single fighting machine required administrative genius of the highest order. The construction of the pontoon bridges across the Hellespont represented perhaps the most ambitious engineering project of the ancient world. The Persian engineers, drawing upon centuries of experience in canal construction and road building, created a marvel that seemed to defy the natural order itself. The sound of thousands of ships being lashed together, the sight of roadways stretching across waters that had previously divided Asia from Europe, provided a visual demonstration of Persian power that was intended to awe both friend and enemy. When the initial bridges were destroyed by a storm, Xerxes' command that the Hellespont be whipped for its disobedience revealed the psychological transformation that the demands of total war had wrought in the Persian court. The young king, who had inherited an empire built on tolerance and accommodation, was becoming something different. A ruler whose will would not be thwarted by gods or men, whose authority extended even to the natural elements themselves. The cutting of the canal across the Athos Peninsula, where Persian engineers carved a waterway through solid rock to avoid the cape where a previous Persian fleet had been destroyed, demonstrated the empire's commitment to removing every obstacle to success. The canal, wide enough for 2 triremes to pass side by side, became a symbol of Persian determination to subordinate nature itself to imperial will. The accumulation of supplies for the expedition required the mobilization of the entire Persian economy. From Egypt came grain to feed the vast host. From Phoenicia came the skilled shipwrights who would maintain the enormous fleet. From Babylon came the mathematicians and engineers who would coordinate the movement of hundreds of thousands of men across thousands of miles. The Persian Empire was transforming itself into a single, vast military machine directed toward the conquest of Greece. The psychological dimension of the preparations was equally important. Xerxes understood that the mere size of his army would serve as a weapon of terror, convincing the Greeks that resistance was futile and encouraging them to surrender without a fight. The careful enumeration of forces, The public display of exotic weapons and unfamiliar warriors, the constant emphasis on the expedition's unprecedented scale. All these elements were designed to create a sense of inevitable doom that would paralyze Greek resistance. As the great army gathered at Sardis, where the royal road began its journey westward, the Persian Empire seemed to have reached the pinnacle of its power. The sight of the vast encampment, where the languages of dozens of nations mingled in the common cause of imperial expansion, represented the fulfillment of the Persian dream of universal monarchy. Yet beneath this display of overwhelming force lay a fundamental miscalculation of the Greek character. The Persians, accustomed to dealing with peoples who valued prosperity and security above independence, could not comprehend the depth of Greek attachment to their local autonomy. The very scale of the expedition, intended to demonstrate Persian invincibility, would instead confirm to many Greeks that their civilization faced an existential threat that required the most desperate forms of resistance. The stage was set for a conflict that would test whether material power could overcome spiritual determination. In the autumn of 481, as the leaves turned golden in the sacred grove of Poseidon at Corinth, representatives from across the Greek world gathered for a congress that would determine whether the independent city-states could overcome centuries of mutual suspicion and rivalry to face the Persian threat. The very fact that such a gathering was possible represented a diplomatic miracle, for the Greek cities had traditionally viewed each other with almost as much hostility as they directed toward barbarian enemies. The Congress of Corinth, as it came to be known, brought together men whose cities had been locked in bitter conflicts for generations. Spartans, whose military prowess was legendary, but whose political system seemed anachronistic to democratic Athens, sat alongside Athenians whose naval power and commercial wealth had made them the envy and fear of their neighbors. Corinthians, whose strategic position at the isthmus made them indispensable to any defensive alliance, negotiated with Thebans whose sympathies were suspected to lean toward the Persian cause. The challenge facing the Greek delegates was not merely military, but psychological. Each city-state had developed its own unique identity, its own particular interpretation of what it meant to be Greek, and its own fierce pride in its local institutions. The Spartan conviction that their military system represented the pinnacle of Greek achievement clashed with the Athenian belief that democracy was the highest form of human government. The Corinthian emphasis on commercial prosperity seemed to both cities to represent a departure from true Greek values. Yet beneath these surface divisions lay deeper currents of shared culture and mutual recognition. The delegates all spoke dialects of the same language, worshipped the same gods, and shared the same epic traditions that traced their origins back to the heroes of Troy. The Persian threat, by its very existence, forced them to confront the question of what they held in common that was worth defending against foreign domination. The oracles, whose pronouncements had guided Greek decision-making for centuries, provided cryptic guidance that seemed to offer both hope and doom. The famous prophecy of the Delphic oracle, with its reference to wooden walls and sacred salamis, would prove crucial to Athenian strategy, while the broader pattern of divine guidance suggested that the gods themselves were divided on the outcome of the coming conflict. The religious dimension of the Greek response to the Persian threat provided a unifying element that transcended political divisions. The military challenges facing the alliance were daunting. The Persian army was estimated to number in the hundreds of thousands, supported by a fleet that dwarfed the combined naval forces of all the Greek cities. Persian gold was already circulating among Greek politicians, seeking to purchase the neutrality or even the active support of key city-states. The Persian reputation for treating defeated enemies with clemency, while rewarding those who submitted voluntarily, created powerful incentives for individual cities to seek accommodation rather than resistance. The Greek response to these challenges revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their political system. The decision to place the allied forces under Spartan command, despite Athens' larger contribution to the common cause, demonstrated the Greeks' ability to subordinate local pride to military necessity. The establishment of common military standards and coordinated strategies showed that Greek political genius could extend beyond the city-state level when survival was at stake. Yet the alliance remained fragile, held together more by fear of Persian domination than by any positive vision of Greek cooperation. The constant negotiations required to maintain unity, the careful balance of interests that had to be preserved to prevent defection, the ongoing suspicion that each city was seeking to advance its own interests at the expense of the common cause. All these factors created a context of chronic instability that the Persians hoped to exploit. The intelligence networks that connected the Greek cities provided crucial information about Persian preparations, but they also revealed the scale of the threat facing the alliance. Reports of the bridge construction at the Hellespont, the massive supply depots being established along the Persian route, the diplomatic missions seeking to secure Persian bases in northern Greece. All these developments confirmed that the coming conflict would be unlike anything the Greeks had previously experienced. The psychological preparation of the Greek population for the coming war required a delicate balance between realism and hope. The political leaders had to acknowledge the severity of the threat while maintaining the morale necessary for effective resistance. The emphasis on Greek freedom, on the unique value of their political institutions, on the divine favor that rewarded those who fought for just causes. All these themes were woven together into a narrative that could inspire ordinary citizens to extraordinary sacrifices. As winter gave way to spring and the Persian army began its march toward Europe, the Greek alliance represented both humanity's best hope for preserving the independence of small nations and a fragile coalition held together by desperation rather than trust. The stage was set for a conflict that would test whether the Greek genius for local autonomy could create the unity necessary to resist imperial domination. In the late summer of 400, as the Persian host flowed southward through the mountain passes of central Greece like a human flood, seeking to engulf the last bastions of independence, 300 Spartan warriors and their allies took their stand at a narrow defile where the mountains met the sea, Thermopylae, the hot gates, where sulphurous springs bubbled up from the earth and the ancient road, squeezed between cliff and shore, would become the stage for humanity's most perfect demonstration of the principle that some things are worth more than life itself. King Leonidas, who led the Spartan contingent, understood with crystalline clarity that he was marching not toward victory, but toward immortality. The oracle at Delphi had spoken with unusual directness: either Sparta would fall or one of her kings would die. The choice, for a man raised in the Spartan system where honor was valued above breath itself, was no choice at all. The 300 warriors who accompanied him had been selected not merely for their military prowess, but for their ability to transform certain death into eternal glory. The Persian army that approached Thermopylae represented the accumulated might of 3 continents, the sight of their endless columns stretching beyond the horizon, their banners representing nations whose names were barely known to Greek geography, their equipment glinting with the wealth of empires, created a spectacle that would have overwhelmed any normal human response. Yet the Spartans, as they went about their final preparations with the calm efficiency that had been drilled into them since childhood, seemed to inhabit a different psychological universe entirely. The famous exchange when a Persian envoy warned that their arrows would darken the sun, "Then we shall fight in the shade," revealed the profound difference between the Persian and Spartan approaches to warfare. Where the Persians sought to overwhelm through superior numbers and equipment, the Spartans had achieved something far more dangerous: the complete transcendence of the fear of death. Their laconic wit, their casual dismissal of overwhelming odds, their evident pleasure in the prospect of a glorious end-all. These elements combined to create a psychological weapon that Persian gold could not purchase. The narrow pass at Thermopylae negated the Persian advantages of numbers and cavalry, forcing them to fight on terms that favored the Greek phalanx. The Spartan warriors, their bronze armor polished to mirror brightness, their red cloaks flowing behind them like rivers of blood, their spears held with the precision that came from decades of training, represented the perfection of Greek military art. Behind their locked shields, they formed not merely a military formation, but a living symbol of the principle that free men could not be conquered by any force on earth. For 2 days, the Persian assault broke against the Spartan line like waves against a rocky shore. The Immortals, Xerxes' elite guard, discovered that their reputation for invincibility meant nothing against men who had already achieved spiritual victory through the acceptance of death, the sound of bronze clashing against bronze, the war cries of warriors who fought not for conquest but for honor, the sight of Persian bodies piling up before the Greek position. All these elements combined to create a spectacle that began to shake Persian confidence in their ultimate victory. Xerxes himself, watching from his throne on the hillside overlooking the pass, began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his experience of warfare. The Persian Empire had conquered through the intelligent application of overwhelming force, but here was an enemy that seemed to grow stronger as the odds against them increased. The sight of 300 men holding at bay the world's greatest army challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Persian power rested. The betrayal of Ephialtes, who revealed to the Persians the mountain path that would allow them to encircle the Greek position, introduced the element of treachery that would transform military defeat into moral victory. When Leonidas learned that Persian forces were moving to surround his position, he faced the final test of Spartan honor. The allied contingents were dismissed to fight another day, but the Spartans remained, along with the Thespians who chose to share their fate and the Thebans who were compelled to stay. The final morning at Thermopylae dawned with the terrible beauty of a day that would live forever in human memory. The Spartans, knowing that this would be their last sight of Helios driving his chariot across the sky, went about their preparations with the ritual solemnity that had marked their entire lives. They combed their long hair, as was their custom before battle, and spoke quietly among themselves of the honor that awaited them in the halls of Hades. The Persian assault, when it came, was overwhelming in its ferocity. Attacked from both front and rear, the Spartan position became untenable within hours. Yet the manner of their destruction elevated the defeat into something approaching religious ecstasy, fighting with broken spears and then with swords, and finally with teeth and nails when their weapons were gone. The Spartans demonstrated that the human spirit could achieve a kind of victory that transcended material circumstances. The death of Leonidas, whose body the Persians mutilated in their fury, became the focal point of a story that would inspire resistance to tyranny for centuries to come. The Greek custom of fighting to recover the bodies of the fallen, which led to the final, desperate struggle over the king's corpse, transformed the battlefield into a sacred space where the deepest Greek values were tested and confirmed. The famous epitaph composed by Simonides, "Stranger, go tell the Spartans that we lie here obedient to their laws," captured the essence of what Thermopylae represented. This was not merely military defeat, but a form of spiritual victory that proved the power of human choice over material circumstances. The Spartans had chosen to die rather than submit, and in that choice they had achieved the kind of immortality that no empire could confer. The Persian victory at Thermopylae was Pyrrhic in the deepest sense. Xerxes had gained a narrow mountain pass, but he had lost something far more valuable: the psychological advantage that comes from being perceived as invincible. The sight of his vast army being held at bay by a handful of Greeks, the realization that conquest of Greece would require the destruction of every defender, the growing understanding that these people would never submit. All these factors began to erode the confidence that had carried the Persian expedition to Europe. The story of Thermopylae spread throughout the Greek world with the speed of wildfire, carrying a message that transformed the nature of the resistance. The Spartan sacrifice had proven that Persian power was not absolute, that free men could choose the terms of their own engagement with tyranny. The 300 had bought time for the Greek fleet to prepare, but more importantly, they had purchased something beyond price, the psychological foundation for continued resistance. As the Persian army continued its march southward, leaving behind the narrow pass where the ground was still dark with blood, the ancient world began to understand that something fundamental had changed. The Persian Empire, which had seemed destined to engulf all of civilization, had encountered a force that could not be conquered because it was willing to be destroyed rather than enslaved. The stage was set for battles that would determine whether the future belonged to imperial power or to the principle that some things are worth more than life itself. In the azure waters of the Saronic Gulf, where the island of Salamis faced the burned ruins of Athens across a narrow strait, the destiny of the Western world would be decided not by the clash of bronze-armed hoplites, but by the collision of wooden ships driven by the desperate courage of free men. The morning of September 23, 480 BCE dawned with the crystalline clarity that often precedes moments of historical transformation, as if the very air itself recognized the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Xerxes, confident that the destruction of the Greek fleet would complete his conquest of Europe, had positioned his throne upon the slopes of Mount Aegaleus, from where he could observe the final act of his great drama of imperial expansion. The Persian fleet, numbering perhaps 800 vessels and manned by the finest sailors from Phoenicia, Egypt, and Ionia, lay anchored in formation that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. The sight of their bronze-reinforced prows glinting in the morning sun, their colourful banners representing the maritime traditions of a dozen nations, created a spectacle of power that should have overwhelmed any reasonable hope of Greek resistance. Yet in the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland, where the Greek fleet huddled in apparent desperation, a different kind of calculation was taking place. Themistocles, the Athenian leader whose strategic vision had persuaded his countrymen to build the fleet that now represented their last hope, understood that the Persian advantage in numbers could be neutralized by the geography of the battlefield he had chosen. The narrow strait would compress the Persian formation, preventing them from using their superior numbers effectively, while the shallow waters would favor the smaller, more maneuverable Greek triremes. The psychological preparation for the battle revealed the fundamental difference between the Persian and Greek approaches to naval warfare. The Persian fleet, composed largely of subject peoples fighting for a distant king, relied upon professional competence and imperial discipline. The Greek ships, manned by citizens who could see their own burned cities on the opposite shore, drew upon the desperate energy of men who had nothing left to lose except their freedom. The pre-battle exhortations, as recorded by those who survived the engagement, captured the essence of what was at stake. The Persian commanders spoke of imperial glory and the rewards that awaited those who served the great king faithfully. The Greek leaders reminded their men that they were fighting not merely for victory, but for the right of their children to live as free men. The contrast between professional obligation and personal commitment would prove decisive in the hours to come. The battle itself, when it began, unfolded with a complexity that defied the simple narratives of later historians. The Persian fleet, despite its numerical superiority, found itself struggling to maintain formation in the restricted waters of the strait. The Greek tactic of ramming, where the bronze-reinforced prows of the triremes were driven into the sides of enemy vessels, proved devastatingly effective against ships that had been designed for open-water combat rather than the brutal close-quarters fighting that characterized the Salamis engagement. The famous cry, "O sons of Greece, advance," Free your fatherland, free your children, your wives, the temples of your ancestral gods, the tombs of your forebears, echoed across the waters as the Greek fleet moved to attack. The sound of oars beating in unison, the chanting of rowers who synchronized their efforts with traditional war songs, the crash of bronze against wood as the first ramming attacks succeeded. All these elements combined to create a sensory experience that transcended ordinary combat. The turning point came when the Persian formation began to collapse, under the combined pressure of Greek ramming attacks and the confusion caused by fighting in restricted waters. Ships that had been designed to fight in line formation found themselves unable to maneuver effectively, while the Greek triremes, handled by crews who had learned seamanship in these very waters, darted between the larger Persian vessels like wolves attacking a flock of sheep. The sight of Persian ships foundering in the strait, their crews struggling in waters that had become a churning mass of broken timber and drowning men, created a psychological shock that rippled through the entire Persian fleet. The navy that had seemed invincible that morning was dissolving into chaos, while the Greek ships, their bronze rams red with enemy blood, continued their relentless attack with the fury of men who had found their enemy's weakness. Xerxes, watching from his throne as his naval supremacy evaporated in the space of a few hours, began to understand that his entire strategic position had been compromised. Without naval control, his army could not be supplied from Asia, while the Greek fleet would be free to attack his communications and threaten his line of retreat. The victory he had expected to witness had become a disaster that threatened the entire Persian expedition. The aftermath of Salamis transformed the strategic balance of the war. The Persian fleet, or what remained of it, withdrew to Asian waters, abandoning the Greek seas to the victorious allies. The psychological impact of the victory spread throughout the Greek world, proving that Persian power was not invincible and encouraging neutral cities to join the resistance. The tide of war had turned, not through the overwhelming force that had carried the Persians to the gates of Europe, but through the superior seamanship and desperate courage of free men fighting for their homeland. As the sun set over the waters of Salamis, now littered with the wreckage of Persian ambitions, the ancient world began to understand that the greatest empire in history had met its match in the stubborn independence of a few Greek city-states. The stage was set for the final act of the drama that would determine whether the future belonged to imperial unity or to the principle that free communities could defend themselves against any tyranny. In the sacred island of Delos, where Apollo had been born among the sacred palm trees, and where the Aegean winds carried the scent of frankincense from marble temples, the victorious Greeks gathered in the year 478 to transform their wartime alliance into an instrument of permanent security. The Delian League, as it would come to be known, began as the noblest of enterprises, a confederation of free cities united in their determination to ensure that the Persian threat would never again menace Greek independence. Yet within this moment of triumph lay the seeds of a transformation that would test the very principles for which the Greeks had fought. The initial charter of the League embodied the highest ideals of Greek political thinking. Each member city would contribute either ships or money to the common defense, with the contributions calculated according to ability rather than imposed by force. The treasury would be maintained on the sacred island of Delos, under the protection of Apollo himself, ensuring that the League's resources would be used only for the common good. Aristides the Just, the Athenian leader whose reputation for fairness had earned him the respect of all Greeks, would oversee the initial assessments with the scrupulous honesty that had made his name synonymous with justice. The early years of the League witnessed a series of brilliant successes that seemed to validate the Greek conviction that free cities could cooperate effectively when guided by shared principles. The liberation of the Greek cities of Asia Minor, where Persian garrisons were expelled and democratic governments restored, demonstrated that the League's military power could be used to extend rather than restrict freedom. The victory at the Eurymedon River, where the Persian fleet was destroyed and the Persian army routed, proved that the League had become a force capable of challenging Persian power on its own territory. Yet success brought with it temptations that would gradually transform the character of the alliance. The Athenian fleet, which provided the backbone of the League's military power, began to assume a dominant role in League affairs that went far beyond its original mandate. The other member cities, increasingly dependent on Athenian naval protection and grateful for the prosperity that the League's activities had brought, gradually acquiesced to Athenian leadership in matters that had originally been subject to collective decision-making. The transfer of the League treasury from Delos to Athens in 454 marked the symbolic moment when the alliance of equals began its transformation into an Athenian empire. The official justification that the treasury would be safer in Athens than on a vulnerable island contained enough truth to make the change seem reasonable. Yet the psychological impact of having the League's resources housed in the Athenian Acropolis, where they could be used to fund Athenian projects as well as common defense, created a new dynamic that would prove impossible to reverse. The construction of the Parthenon, funded partly by League resources, embodied both the glory and the contradiction of Athenian hegemony. The temple itself, with its perfect proportions and sublime sculptures, represented the highest achievement of Greek art and the visible symbol of the cultural confidence that victory over Persia had inspired. Yet the use of allied contributions to fund what was essentially an Athenian monument created resentment among the member cities that would fester for decades. The gradual transformation of the League from alliance to empire revealed the fundamental tension between the Greek ideals of freedom and the practical necessities of power. The Athenian argument that their leadership was necessary for the common defense contained enough truth to be persuasive, yet the growing restrictions on the autonomy of member cities contradicted the very principles that had inspired the original resistance to Persia. The League had become a victim of its own success, its military achievements creating the conditions for the concentration of power that would ultimately destroy it. The revolt of Naxos in 470 and its subsequent suppression marked the first clear indication that the League was evolving into something its founders had never intended. The sight of Athenian ships blockading a Greek city, forcing its submission to League authority, created a precedent that would be repeated dozens of times in the coming decades. The distinction between liberation and conquest, which had seemed so clear during the Persian Wars, began to blur as Athenian power grew. The psychological impact of this transformation extended far beyond the immediate participants. The Greek cities that had not joined the League watched with growing anxiety as Athenian power expanded, while the Persians began to understand that Greek disunity might provide them with opportunities for revenge that military force had failed to achieve. The stage was being set for a new kind of conflict, one that would pit Greeks against Greeks and ultimately vindicate the Persian strategy of patient waiting. The intellectual response to these developments revealed the sophistication of Greek political thinking. The debate over the nature of empire, the relationship between power and justice, the tension between individual freedom and collective security. All these themes would find their fullest expression in the historical and philosophical works of the classical age. The League's transformation from alliance to empire provided the raw material for political analysis that would influence Western thought for centuries to come. As the sun set over the Aegean, where Athenian triremes patrolled waters that had once been defended by a coalition of equals, the Greek world began to confront the painful truth that victory could be more dangerous than defeat. The Persian Wars had ended with the triumph of Greek freedom, but the peace that followed would test whether free cities could maintain their independence in the face of the imperial ambitions of their own liberators. The stage was set for a new kind of tragedy, one that would demonstrate the eternal tension between the ideals that inspire great achievements and the realities that complicate their implementation. In the marble workshops of Athens, where the sound of chisel meeting stone echoed through the clear morning air, The victory over Persia was being transformed into something that would outlast bronze and gold, a cultural flowering that would define the spiritual foundations of Western civilization. The confidence that came from having defeated the world's greatest empire, combined with the prosperity that flowed from Athenian leadership of the Delian League, created the conditions for an intellectual renaissance that would prove more enduring than any military conquest. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the man who would become known as the father of history, found in the Persian Wars the perfect subject for his revolutionary approach to understanding the past. Where previous generations had been content with mythical explanations and poetic narratives, Herodotus applied the rational inquiry that had characterized Greek philosophy to the great events of his own time. His investigation of the causes of the Persian Wars, his careful collection of eyewitness accounts, his systematic comparison of different cultural traditions, all these elements combined to create a new form of literature that would influence how humanity understood its own development. The histories of Herodotus did more than simply record the events of the Persian Wars. They provided a framework for understanding the relationship between different cultures and the role of human choice in shaping historical outcomes. The portrayal of both Greeks and Persians as complex human beings responding to the pressures of their circumstances, rather than as simple heroes and villains, demonstrated a psychological sophistication that would become characteristic of Greek intellectual achievement. In the theatre of Dionysus, where the spring festivals brought the entire Athenian population together for dramatic competitions, the Persian Wars provided material for a new form of artistic expression. Aeschylus, who had fought at Marathon and Salamis, transformed his battlefield experiences into tragic dramas that explored the universal themes of pride, power, and divine justice. The Persians, which portrayed the defeat of Xerxes from the Persian perspective, demonstrated the Greek capacity to find universal human truth, even in the defeat of their enemies. The dramatic festivals that became central to Athenian cultural life represented more than entertainment. They were civic rituals that reinforced the democratic values for which the Greeks had fought. The participation of the entire citizen body in these celebrations, the competitive nature of the performances, the integration of religious observance with artistic achievement, all these elements combined to create a cultural institution that embodied the Greek ideal of the polis as a community of free men engaged in the pursuit of excellence. The philosophical schools that flourished in post-war Athens found in the Persian Wars confirmation of their conviction that human reason could uncover universal truths about the nature of reality. The Socratic method, with its emphasis on questioning assumptions and examining the logical foundations of belief, reflected the intellectual confidence that came from having successfully challenged the greatest empire in history. The willingness to subject even the most sacred traditions to rational analysis demonstrated the revolutionary character of Greek intellectual achievement. The architectural monuments that rose on the Athenian Acropolis provided a visual demonstration of the cultural confidence that victory had inspired. The Parthenon, with its perfect proportions and sublime sculptures, represented more than religious devotion. It was a statement about the capacity of human beings to create beauty that rivaled the works of the gods themselves. The integration of architectural, sculptural, and painted elements into a unified artistic vision demonstrated the Greek belief that all aspects of human experience could be harmonized through the application of reason and aesthetic judgment. The development of scientific thinking in the post-war period revealed another dimension of Greek intellectual achievement. The observation of natural phenomena, the formulation of hypotheses to explain observed regularities, the testing of theoretical predictions against empirical evidence, all these elements of what would later be called the scientific method had their origins in the intellectual confidence that came from having successfully challenged the assumptions of traditional authority. The Persian Wars had demonstrated that received wisdom could be questioned, and that seemingly impossible goals could be achieved through the application of human intelligence and determination. This lesson, learned on the battlefields of Marathon and Salamis, would be applied to every aspect of human experience, from the movement of the stars to the organization of political communities. The influence of Greek cultural achievement extended far beyond the boundaries of the Greek world itself. The artistic styles developed in post-war Athens would influence the visual arts throughout the Mediterranean basin, while Greek philosophical methods would provide the foundation for intellectual inquiry in every subsequent civilization. The Persian Wars had not merely preserved Greek independence, they had created the conditions for cultural developments that would influence human thought for millennia. As the marble dust settled in the workshops where sculptors were creating images that would define beauty for future generations, and as the voices of actors in the theatre of Dionysus carried across the city, the timeless themes of human aspiration and limitation, the ancient world began to understand that the Greek victory over Persia had produced something unprecedented in human history. The stage was set for a classical age that would demonstrate the capacity of human reason and creativity to achieve forms of excellence that would outlast the empires that had made them possible. In the closing decades of the 5th century, as the olive groves of Attica lay trampled beneath the feet of Spartan armies, and the harbours of the Aegean echoed with the war cries of Greek fighting Greek, the ancient world witnessed one of history's most bitter ironies. The generation that had united to defeat the Persian Empire now turned their weapons against each other with a ferocity that made their previous struggles seem like mere preparation for this ultimate tragedy. The Peloponnesian War, which would consume the Greek world for nearly 3 decades, had its origins in the very success that had made Greek victory over Persia possible. The Athenian Empire, which had grown from the noble alliance of the Delian League, had become so powerful that it threatened the independence of every other Greek city-state. The Spartans, who had led the resistance against Persian tyranny, found themselves compelled to resist what they saw as Athenian tyranny, creating a conflict that would vindicate every Persian prediction about the impossibility of Greek unity. The war itself unfolded with a complexity that revealed how much the Greek world had changed since the heroic days of Marathon and Thermopylae. The Athenian strategy of avoiding land battles while using their naval superiority to strike at Spartan allies demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military power and political objectives. The Spartan response, which involved the systematic devastation of Attic farmland and the encouragement of Helot revolts, showed that they had learned from their enemies the importance of attacking economic foundations rather than merely seeking battlefield victories. Yet beneath these tactical innovations lay a deeper tragedy. The Greek cities that had once stood together against Persian invasion now sought Persian gold to fund their mutual destruction. The sight of Spartan ambassadors in the Persian court, negotiating for the subsidies that would enable them to continue their war against Athens, represented a betrayal of everything the Persian Wars had supposedly achieved. The Persians, who had been expelled from Greek waters at the cost of so much blood, were welcomed back as allies in the fratricidal conflict that was tearing the Greek world apart. The psychological impact of this development was devastating. The Persian Empire, which had seemed permanently weakened by the defeats of the previous generation, began to recover its influence in Greek affairs, not through military conquest, but through the skillful exploitation of Greek disunity. Persian diplomats, who had once been treated as representatives of a hostile power, found themselves courted by Greek politicians who needed Persian resources to continue their wars against fellow Greeks. The Battle of Aegispotami in 405, where the Spartan fleet destroyed the last remnants of Athenian naval power, marked the effective end of the Athenian Empire that had grown from the victory over Persia. The sight of Athenian triremes, which had once struck terror into Persian hearts, burning in the waters of the Hellespont, provided a visual symbol of how completely the Greek world had been transformed by internal conflict. The aftermath of Athenian defeat revealed the full extent of the Greek tragedy. The democratic institutions that had inspired the resistance to Persian tyranny were replaced by the oligarchic governments that Sparta imposed on its defeated enemies. The cultural flowering that had made Athens the school of Greece was ended by the economic devastation that accompanied military defeat. The confidence that had enabled Greek intellectual achievement was replaced by a cynicism that questioned whether any human institution could be trusted to endure. The Persian response to these developments demonstrated the patience and skill that had always characterized their diplomacy. Rather than seeking immediate revenge for the defeats of the previous generation, the Persians had waited for the Greeks to exhaust themselves in mutual conflict. The King's Peace of 387, which was imposed by Persian mediation and guaranteed by Persian power, represented the final vindication of the Persian strategy of patient waiting. The terms of the King's Peace revealed how completely the balance of power had shifted. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, which had been liberated from Persian rule at such great cost, were returned to Persian control. The Greek mainland, which had successfully resisted Persian invasion, was now divided into spheres of influence that were guaranteed by Persian authority. The Persian Empire, which had seemed permanently weakened by its defeats, had recovered its dominance in Greek affairs without fighting a single major battle. The intellectual response to these developments reflected the sophistication of Greek political analysis. The recognition that victory could be more dangerous than defeat, that success could create the conditions for subsequent failure, that human institutions were subject to the same cycles of growth and decay that characterized all natural phenomena. All these insights would find their fullest expression in the historical and philosophical works of the 4th century. As the sun set over the Aegean, where Persian ships once again patrolled waters that had been liberated by Greek sacrifice, the ancient world began to understand that the Persian wars had not provided a final resolution to the conflict between East and West. The stage was set for new forms of confrontation that would test whether any human achievement could escape the eternal cycle of rise and decline that seemed to govern all mortal enterprises. In the aftermath of the Persian Wars, as the smoke of battle cleared from the fields of Plataea and the broken timbers of Persian ships washed ashore on Greek beaches, something extraordinary began to stir in the minds of those who had witnessed the impossible: the triumph of small, fractured city-states against the mightiest empire the world had ever known. This was not merely the end of a military conflict, but the beginning of an intellectual revolution that would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of itself, its place in the cosmos, and the very nature of existence. The veterans who returned from Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea carried with them more than bronze armor and Persian spoils. They bore within their memories the profound experience of having encountered an entirely alien way of organizing human society, of understanding the divine, and of conceptualizing the relationship between individual will and cosmic order. The Persian Empire, with its vast bureaucracy, its religious tolerance, and its sophisticated administrative systems, had presented the Greeks with a mirror in which they could see their own assumptions reflected and questioned for the first time. Picture, if you will, the Agora of Athens in the decades following the Persian retreat, where weathered soldiers gathered in the shade of plane trees to debate questions that had never before demanded answers. These were men who had stood in the phalanx at Marathon, who had rowed the triremes at Salamis, who had seen the seemingly infinite ranks of Persian infantry stretching across the Boeotian plain. They had witnessed not just military might, but an alternative vision of human civilization. One that suggested there might be multiple valid ways of organizing society, multiple paths to understanding the divine, multiple frameworks for comprehending justice and truth. The psychological impact of this encounter cannot be overstated. For generations, Greeks had lived within the comfortable certainties of their local traditions, their ancestral customs, their particular gods and heroes. The Persian Wars shattered these comfortable certainties, not through defeat and conquest, but through the far more unsettling experience of victory over a civilization that possessed its own sophisticated answers to life's fundamental questions. The Greeks discovered that their triumph was not simply military, but intellectual. They had prevailed not because their way of life was obviously superior, but because they had been forced to examine, question, and ultimately defend their most basic assumptions about human nature and social organization. This intellectual ferment found its most profound expression in the emergence of systematic philosophical inquiry. Consider Anaxagoras of Clazomenae, who had likely encountered Persian cosmological concepts during his youth in Ionia. His revolutionary declaration that mind nous was the organizing principle of the universe represented a direct response to the Persian concept of Ahura Mazda as the supreme intelligence governing cosmic order. Yet Anaxagoras transformed this borrowed insight into something distinctly Greek, a rational, investigable principle that could be understood through human reason rather than divine revelation. The sensory details of this intellectual awakening permeate the historical record. In the gymnasiums of Athens, where citizens exercised their bodies and minds in equal measure, the sound of philosophical debate mingled with the rhythmic chanting of athletic training. The scent of olive oil mixed with the incense of nearby temples, creating an atmosphere where physical and intellectual excellence were understood as complementary aspects of human flourishing. Here, in these spaces of democratic discourse, the questions raised by the Persian encounter found their most sophisticated expression. Protagoras of Abdera, whose famous declaration that man is the measure of all things, emerged directly from the cultural relativism revealed by the Persian Wars, embodied this new intellectual boldness. Having witnessed the Persian system of governance, where local customs were respected and diverse religious practices were tolerated, Protagoras recognized that human customs and beliefs were not universal truths, but cultural constructions. This insight, radical for its time, laid the foundation for centuries of philosophical inquiry into the nature of knowledge, morality, and social organization. The contemplative atmosphere of post-war Athens fostered an unprecedented openness to questioning received wisdom. Veterans who had seen Persian fire temples and Greek hero shrines, who had witnessed both Persian administrative efficiency and Greek democratic chaos, began to ask fundamental questions about the relationship between human institutions and divine will. The comfortable certainties of ancestral tradition gave way to systematic inquiry into the nature of justice, the source of political authority, and the proper relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. This intellectual transformation was not merely academic, but profoundly practical. The Greeks had learned from their Persian encounter that effective governance required not just military prowess, but sophisticated understanding of human psychology, economic organization, and cultural diversity. The Persian system of satrapies, with its careful balance of central authority and local autonomy, provided a model that influenced Greek thinking about federal organization and interstate relations. The Persian postal system, with its efficient relay stations and standardized communications, demonstrated possibilities for coordination and administration that Greek thinkers would adapt to their own democratic contexts. The Persian concept of cosmic dualism, the eternal struggle between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, order and chaos, found its Greek expression in the dialectical thinking that would characterize classical philosophy. The idea that truth emerges through the confrontation of opposing forces that wisdom develops through the examination of contradictory perspectives, reflects the Persian influence on Greek intellectual development. Yet the Greeks characteristically transformed this borrowed insight into something distinctly their own, a methodology for systematic inquiry rather than a religious doctrine. The irony of this intellectual revolution was profound. Greek victory over Persia had not led to cultural insularity, but to an unprecedented openness to foreign ideas and alternative perspectives. The triumph of Greek arms had created the psychological security necessary for Greeks to examine their own assumptions critically, and to incorporate insights from the very civilization they had defeated. This intellectual courage, born from military confidence, would prove to be the Persian War's most enduring legacy. Modern observers can recognize in this ancient transformation patterns that continue to shape intellectual development today. Cross-cultural encounters, whether through military conflict, commercial exchange, or diplomatic contact, consistently generate philosophical innovation by forcing societies to confront the relativity of their own assumptions. The Persian Wars demonstrated that intellectual progress often emerges not from isolation, but from the challenging encounter with radically different ways of understanding human existence. The philosophical revolution initiated by the Persian Wars would reach its culmination in the systematic inquiries of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but its origins lay in the profound psychological impact of cultural collision. The Greeks had learned that their particular answers to life's fundamental questions were not the only possible answers, and this recognition liberated them to pursue more systematic and rigorous methods of inquiry. The Persian Wars had taught them that human reason, properly employed, could examine any question, challenge any assumption, and discover new truths about the nature of existence itself. As we drift towards sleep, we might reflect on how this ancient intellectual courage continues to inspire contemporary thought. The Greeks' willingness to question their deepest assumptions, to learn from their enemies, and to transform cultural collision into philosophical insight reminds us that true wisdom often emerges not from the comfort of familiar certainties, but from the challenging encounter with alternative possibilities. In their intellectual revolution, we glimpse the eternal human capacity to transform conflict into understanding, to convert military triumph into wisdom, and to discover, in the most unlikely circumstances, the seeds of lasting enlightenment. In the vast amphitheater of ancient warfare, where bronze met bronze and the fate of civilizations hung suspended like morning mist over bloodied fields, the Persian Wars were understood by their participants not merely as political contests or territorial disputes, but as cosmic dramas in which the very gods themselves had chosen sides. This was a conflict that transcended the material realm, ascending into the ethereal domains where divine will manifested through human action, where the sacred and profane intertwined in ways that would shape religious consciousness for millennia to come. The Persian understanding of their imperial mission was profoundly theological, rooted in the cosmic dualism that Zoroaster had articulated centuries earlier in the windswept plateaus of ancient Iran. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, stood as the supreme deity of truth and light, engaged in eternal struggle against Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness and falsehood. This was not merely a religious abstraction, but a living cosmological framework that informed every aspect of Persian imperial ideology. The great kings of Persia understood themselves as earthly representatives of cosmic order, their expansion across the known world representing the triumph of divine light over the chaotic darkness of uncivilized existence. Imagine, if you will, the sacred fire altars that dotted the Persian Empire from the Oxus to the Nile, their eternal flames flickering in carefully tended sanctuaries where Zoroastrian priests maintained the ritual purity necessary for divine communication. The sweet smoke of frankincense and myrrh rose from these altars like prayers made manifest, carrying the supplications of emperors and subjects alike toward the luminous realm of Ahura Mazda. In the Persian conception, military victory was not merely strategic success, but divine validation proof that the cosmic order favored their cause and blessed their expansion with supernatural sanction. The Persian approach to religious diversity within their empire reflected this cosmic confidence. Unlike the narrow sectarianism that would characterize later imperial systems, the Achaemenid rulers practiced a sophisticated theological pluralism, recognizing that different peoples might worship the same cosmic principles through varying cultural expressions. The Cylinder of Cyrus the Great, that remarkable document of ancient tolerance, proclaimed the Persian commitment to preserving local religious traditions while integrating them into the broader cosmic order. This was not mere political pragmatism, but theological sophistication, a recognition that divine truth might manifest through multiple cultural channels while maintaining its essential unity. The Greeks, scattered across their mountainous peninsulas and island strongholds, possessed a fundamentally different conception of divine involvement in human affairs. Their pantheon reflected not cosmic dualism, but the complex interplay of competing forces, each deity representing different aspects of human experience and natural phenomena. Zeus wielded thunderbolts from Mount Olympus, but his authority was constantly challenged by other immortals who possessed their own spheres of influence and their own relationships with mortal humanity. This polytheistic complexity created a religious landscape where divine favor was neither permanent nor predictable, where even the most pious mortals might find themselves caught between competing celestial loyalties. The Delphic oracle, that most sacred of Greek religious institutions, embodied this theological complexity in its very structure and function. Picture the sacred precinct at Delphi, where the intoxicating vapors rose from fissures in the earth, where the Pythia sat upon her sacred tripod, her consciousness altered by divine inspiration and natural gases, her utterances interpreted by priests who understood that divine truth often came wrapped in ambiguous language that required careful human interpretation. The oracle's prophecies regarding the Persian wars, the enigmatic references to wooden walls, the promise that Zeus would grant Athens a bulwark of wood, the warning that many would die before sacred Salamis, demonstrated the Greek understanding that divine communication was neither simple nor straightforward. The religious dimensions of the Persian wars manifested most dramatically in the rituals and ceremonies that preceded major battles. Before the clash at Marathon, both sides engaged in elaborate sacrificial preparations, seeking divine favor through offerings that transformed the profane act of killing into sacred service. The Persian fire ceremonies, with their careful attention to ritual purity and cosmic alignment, stood in stark contrast to the Greek blood sacrifices, where the entrails of oxen and sheep were examined for divine signs, and the smoke of burnt offerings carried prayers skyward to the immortal gods. The psychological impact of these religious preparations cannot be understated. Warriors on both sides understood themselves as participants in cosmic drama, their individual courage and skill serving purposes that transcended personal survival or political loyalty. The Persian soldier advanced in the knowledge that he served the cosmic order, that his victory would represent the triumph of light over darkness, truth over falsehood. The Greek hoplite stood in the phalanx, believing that his city's patron deity watched over his actions, that his heroic deeds might earn immortal fame and divine blessing. The aftermath of major battles revealed how profoundly religious interpretation shaped the understanding of military outcomes. The Persian defeat at Marathon was not merely a tactical setback, but a theological crisis that required explanation within the framework of cosmic dualism. How could the servants of Ahura Mazda, the representatives of divine truth, suffer defeat at the hands of polytheistic city-states that worshipped multiple deities of questionable moral authority? Persian religious thinkers developed sophisticated theological responses to this challenge. suggesting that temporary setbacks might serve larger cosmic purposes, that divine justice operated on timescales that transcended human understanding. The Greeks, conversely, interpreted their victories as validation of their religious practices and proof of their god's superior power. The trophy erected at Marathon, constructed from captured Persian weapons and armor, was not merely a military monument, but a religious offering, a permanent expression of gratitude to the deities who had granted victory against impossible odds. The dedication of Persian spoils in Greek temples transformed the material artifacts of warfare into sacred objects that would remind future generations of divine favor and human heroism. The religious complexity of the Persian wars extended beyond the battlefield to encompass the broader question of how divine justice operated in human affairs. The Persian concept of cosmic order suggested that imperial expansion served divine purposes, that the incorporation of diverse peoples into a unified empire represented the triumph of universal truth over local superstition. The Greek understanding of divine justice, filtered through their tragic sensibility, suggested that even legitimate actions might carry unintended consequences, that hubris, the arrogant overstepping of human limitations. This theological tension found its most profound expression in the Greek interpretation of Xerxes' invasion as an act of cosmic hubris. The Persian king's decision to bridge the Hellespont, effectively joining Asia and Europe in defiance of natural boundaries, was understood by Greeks as a violation of divine order that demanded supernatural punishment. The storms that destroyed the first bridge were interpreted as divine warnings, while Xerxes' decision to whip the waters and brand them with hot irons was seen as blasphemous rage against the gods themselves. The Athenian evacuation before the Battle of Salamis represented perhaps the most dramatic example of religious faith-shaping military strategy. The decision to abandon their city and trust their fate to wooden ships was based not merely on tactical calculation, but on religious interpretation of the Delphic oracle's prophecies. The psychological courage required for this decision, to leave behind homes, temples, and ancestral graves, could only have emerged from profound religious conviction that divine will transcended human attachment to material possessions. The sacred and profane dimensions of the Persian wars ultimately transformed both civilizations' understanding of the relationship between divine will and human action. The Persian experience of defeat forced a more sophisticated theological understanding of how cosmic justice operated through historical time, while the Greek experience of victory reinforced their conviction that divine favor rewarded courage, wisdom, and respect for proper religious observance. As we reflect on these ancient religious dimensions, we recognize patterns that continue to shape human conflict and resolution. The conviction that one's cause serves higher purposes, that military struggle reflects cosmic significance, that divine favor validates human action. These themes persist across cultures and centuries, reminding us that warfare, however brutal or pragmatic, is often understood by its participants as serving purposes that transcend immediate political objectives. The Persian Wars demonstrated that religious conviction could both inspire extraordinary human courage and provide frameworks for understanding defeat and victory within larger cosmic purposes. The sacred and profane were not separate realms, but intertwined aspects of human experience, each giving meaning to the other in ways that continue to influence how societies understand the relationship between divine will and human responsibility in times of crisis and transformation. In the crucible of ancient warfare, where survival depended upon the marriage of human ingenuity and material possibility, the Persian Wars catalyzed a technological revolution that would fundamentally transform the very nature of human conflict and, by extension, the trajectory of civilization itself. This was not merely a contest of armies, but a laboratory of innovation where the pressures of existential struggle compressed centuries of potential development into decades of urgent necessity, producing advances that would echo through millennia of human achievement. The Persian Empire, stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, represented a technological marvel of unprecedented scale and sophistication. Consider the Royal Road, that arterial masterpiece of imperial engineering that connected Sardis to Susa across nearly 1,700 miles of diverse terrain. This was not merely a pathway carved through wilderness, but a comprehensive infrastructure system that included relay stations positioned with mathematical precision, each equipped with fresh horses, provisions, and communication facilities that enabled imperial messengers to traverse the known world in a mere week. The technological achievement lay not in any single innovation, but in the systematic integration of multiple solutions: road construction, animal husbandry, logistical coordination, and administrative communication, into a unified system that redefined the very concept of distance and time. The Persian military machine itself represented a technological synthesis of breathtaking complexity. Their composite bows, crafted from horn, wood, and sinew through techniques that had been refined across generations of nomadic warfare, could launch arrows with devastating accuracy at distances that rendered traditional Mediterranean tactics obsolete. The metallurgical sophistication required to produce these weapons, the precise understanding of material properties, the mastery of adhesives and bindings, the ergonomic design that maximized human efficiency, represented accumulated knowledge that spanned continents and centuries. Each bow was not merely a weapon, but a condensed library of technological wisdom, embodying the collective intelligence of cultures from the Scythian steppes to the workshops of Babylon. The Persian approach to siege warfare demonstrated their technological adaptability and innovation. Their engineers developed sophisticated techniques for undermining fortifications, employing mathematical principles to calculate angles of approach that would maximize structural damage while minimizing defender response. The siege towers they constructed were marvels of engineering, multi-story structures that could be assembled on-site and maneuvered into position despite their enormous weight and complexity. These were not crude battering devices, but precisely calculated instruments of war, incorporating principles of leverage, counterweight, and defensive architecture that would influence military engineering for centuries to come. Perhaps most remarkably, the Persian invasion of Greece required technological innovations that challenged the very boundaries between the possible and impossible. The bridging of the Hellespont represented an engineering achievement that contemporaries regarded as literally superhuman. The conquest of geography through human intellect and determination. Picture the construction process: hundreds of ships anchored in precise formation, their hulls serving as foundations for a roadway that would bear the weight of the largest army the world had ever seen. The cables required for this undertaking were marvels of rope-making technology, woven from flax and papyrus, with tensile strength calculations that pushed ancient engineering to its absolute limits. The coordination required, the synchronization of weather patterns, tidal movements, and logistical scheduling, represented a triumph of systematic planning that prefigured modern project management techniques. The cutting of the Athos Canal demonstrated Persian willingness to reshape geography itself in service of military objectives. This was not merely excavation, but a comprehensive engineering project that required sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles, soil mechanics, and coastal engineering. The Persian engineers who directed this work possessed knowledge of water flow patterns, sediment management, and structural reinforcement that would not be surpassed in Europe for over a millennium. The canal represented a philosophical as well as technological achievement. The conviction that human intelligence could overcome any natural obstacle, that the material world could be reshaped according to human will and divine purpose. The Greek response to Persian technological superiority demonstrated how necessity could accelerate innovation beyond all previous boundaries. The Athenian naval program, initiated in the wake of Marathon, represented perhaps the most dramatic technological transformation in ancient history. The trireme, that marvel of ancient naval architecture, embodied principles of hydrodynamic efficiency, structural engineering, and human ergonomics that pushed shipbuilding technology to its theoretical limits. Consider the precision required, the calculation of hull displacement, the optimization of rowing efficiency, the integration of ram warfare with traditional naval tactics. Each trireme represented months of skilled craftsmanship, incorporating innovations in metallurgy, woodworking, and rope making that had been developed specifically for this unprecedented naval expansion. The bronze working techniques developed for hoplite equipment during this period represented a quantum leap in metallurgical sophistication. The famous Corinthian helmet, with its distinctive profile and protective capabilities, required understanding of metal properties, heat treatment, and ergonomic design that pushed ancient craftsmanship to new heights. The spear points and sword blades forged in Greek workshops incorporated techniques for creating steel-hard edges while maintaining flexible cores, preventing the catastrophic breakage that could determine battle outcomes. These were not merely weapons, but expressions of technological artistry, each piece representing accumulated generations of metallurgical knowledge refined through the urgent necessities of warfare. The logistical innovations required to support the Greek resistance were equally remarkable. The provisioning of the Athenian fleet, the coordination of allied forces, the management of refugee populations. These challenges demanded solutions that pushed ancient administrative technology beyond all previous limits. The development of standardized weights and measures, the creation of efficient record-keeping systems, the establishment of communication networks that could coordinate military responses across the fragmented Greek world. These innovations would influence commercial and governmental practices for centuries to come. The siege technologies developed during the Persian Wars represented a fascinating dialogue between offensive and defensive innovation. As Persian engineers developed more sophisticated techniques for breaching fortifications, Greek defenders responded with equally sophisticated countermeasures. The use of Greek fire, that mysterious incendiary compound whose exact composition remains debated by modern scholars, represented a chemical technology that bordered on the alchemical. The development of defensive artillery, the refinement of fortification design, the creation of early warning systems. These innovations demonstrated how technological development accelerated when competing civilizations pushed each other toward ever greater levels of sophistication. The Persian Wars also catalyzed advances in what we might recognize as information technology. The Persian postal system, with its relay stations and standardized protocols, represented perhaps the most sophisticated communication network in ancient history. The development of standardized coinage, the refinement of writing systems, the creation of accurate mapping techniques. These innovations facilitated not merely military coordination, but the broader economic and cultural exchanges that would shape the ancient world. The Greeks, in response, developed their own innovations in information management, creating systems for democratic decision-making, record-keeping, and cultural transmission that would influence Western civilization for millennia. The metallurgical advances achieved during this period extended far beyond military applications. The techniques developed for creating superior weapons translated into improvements in agricultural tools, construction materials, and artistic expression. The Persian tradition of goldsmithing, refined through centuries of imperial patronage, produced artifacts of stunning beauty and technical sophistication. The Greek development of bronze working techniques enabled the creation of sculptures and architectural elements that would define classical aesthetics for centuries to come. These technological advances in metalworking represented not merely practical improvements, but fundamental expansions of human creative possibility. The naval innovations pioneered during the Persian Wars would influence maritime technology for over a millennium. The trireme design, with its optimized balance of speed, maneuverability, and firepower, established principles of naval architecture that would govern Mediterranean shipbuilding well into the Roman period. The development of naval tactics, the refinement of port construction, the creation of maintenance and supply systems, these innovations demonstrated how military necessity could drive technological development across multiple interconnected fields. The Persian Wars also accelerated developments in what we might recognize as early engineering principles: the construction of defensive walls, the design of harbor facilities, the creation of siege-resistant architecture. These projects required mathematical understanding, material science knowledge, and project management skills that pushed ancient engineering capabilities to unprecedented levels. The famous Long Walls of Athens, constructed in the aftermath of the Persian invasion, represented an engineering achievement that demonstrated how military necessity could inspire architectural innovation of lasting significance. Perhaps most remarkably, the technological innovations of the Persian Wars demonstrated how cross-cultural exchange could accelerate development beyond what any single civilization might achieve in isolation. Persian engineering techniques influenced Greek construction methods, while Greek innovations in metallurgy were adopted and refined by Persian craftsmen. The technological dialogue between these civilizations, conducted through the medium of warfare, produced advances that neither could have achieved independently. The long-term implications of these technological developments extended far beyond their immediate military applications. The administrative techniques developed for managing large-scale military operations influenced governmental and commercial practices throughout the ancient world. The engineering principles discovered through siege warfare and fortification design would influence architecture and construction for centuries. The metallurgical innovations achieved through weapons development would transform agriculture, craftsmanship, and artistic expression across the Mediterranean world. As we reflect on these ancient technological achievements from our modern perspective, we recognize patterns that continue to shape human development. The relationship between military necessity and technological innovation, the role of cross-cultural exchange in accelerating development, the way that practical solutions to immediate problems can transform broader human capabilities. These themes persist across historical periods, reminding us that technological progress often emerges from the crucible of human conflict and cooperation. The Persian Wars thus represent not merely a political or military turning point, but a technological watershed that demonstrated humanity's capacity to transform necessity into innovation, conflict into creativity, and immediate practical challenges into lasting expansions of human possibility. In their technological legacy, we glimpse the eternal human drive to transcend limitations through ingenuity, to transform the material world through intelligence and determination, and to discover, in the most challenging circumstances, the seeds of lasting progress. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the marble columns of ancient temples catch the first light of morning and the olive groves whisper with the breath of eternity, we find ourselves at the end of a journey that has carried us through one of history's most profound confrontations between human ideals and the relentless pressures of political reality. The Persian Wars, which began with the dreams of empire and independence, have revealed themselves to be not merely a historical episode, but a timeless meditation on the nature of human ambition, courage, and the eternal struggle between order and freedom. the echoes of Marathon still resonate in our modern world, where small nations continue to face the challenge of maintaining their independence against overwhelming odds. The courage of the Athenian hoplites, charging across the plain toward an enemy that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude, speaks to something eternal in the human spirit. The willingness to risk everything for the sake of principles that transcend material calculation. In every age, in every corner of the world, men and women have found themselves facing the same choice that confronted the Greeks at Marathon, whether to submit to superior force or to resist in the name of ideals that make life worth living. The sacrifice of the 300 at Thermopylae has become a universal symbol of the principle that some things are worth more than life itself. The sight of Leonidas and his companions, calmly preparing for death in the service of their city's honor, reminds us that human beings possess a capacity for transcendence that no amount of material power can defeat. The Spartan willingness to die rather than submit continues to inspire those who face impossible odds in the service of justice and freedom. The victory at Salamis, where Greek seamanship and courage overcame Persian numbers and resources, demonstrates that technological superiority and numerical advantage cannot guarantee victory against opponents who fight with the desperation of free men defending their homeland. The narrow waters of the strait, where the fate of Western civilization was decided by the collision of wooden ships and bronze rams, remind us that human creativity and determination can overcome even the most overwhelming material disadvantages. Yet the story of the Persian Wars also carries darker lessons about the corrupting influence of power and the difficulty of maintaining noble ideals in the face of practical pressures. The transformation of the Delian League from a defensive alliance into an Athenian empire illustrates the eternal tendency of liberators to become oppressors, of protectors to become exploiters. The Athenians, who had fought so heroically for their own freedom, found themselves denying that same freedom to others, creating the conditions for the civil wars that would ultimately destroy the Greek world. The Persian Empire itself, for all its apparent failure, demonstrated virtues that the Greeks were unable to match. The Persian genius for accommodation, for finding ways to unite diverse peoples under a single political system while respecting their local customs and traditions, represents an achievement that modern multicultural societies continue to struggle to emulate. The Persian defeat in the military confrontation with Greece should not obscure the fact that their political innovations provided the foundation for every subsequent attempt at universal government. The ultimate irony of the Persian Wars lies in their demonstration that victory and defeat are often less important than the cultural and intellectual achievements that survive long after the last veteran has died. The Greek victory over Persia created the conditions for the flowering of classical civilization, but it was the Persian challenge that forced the Greeks to articulate their deepest values and to develop the intellectual tools that would influence human thought for millennia. In our own time, when the forces of globalization and localization struggle for dominance, when the tension between unity and diversity continues to shape international relations, when the question of whether human beings can govern themselves remains as urgent as ever, the Persian Wars offer both inspiration and warning. They remind us that the ideals of freedom and independence are never permanently secure, that they must be defended anew by each generation, and that the price of their preservation is eternal vigilance. As we drift towards sleep in our modern world, troubled by our own conflicts and uncertainties, we can take comfort in the knowledge that the essential human struggles never change. The questions that confronted the Greeks and Persians 25 centuries ago, how to balance individual freedom with collective security, how to maintain justice in the face of power, how to preserve what is best in human nature while acknowledging what is worst. The stars that witnessed the battles of Marathon and Salamis continue their eternal dance across the night sky, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, yet somehow bearing witness to the moments when human beings transcend their limitations and achieve something approaching the divine. In understanding these ancient conflicts, we gain not merely historical knowledge, but perspective on our own struggles, comfort in the continuity of human experience, and hope that the values worth defending will always find defenders willing to pay their price. Sleep well, knowing that the courage of the Greeks and the wisdom of the Persians live on in every generation that faces the choice between freedom and security, between the easy path of submission and the difficult road of independence. The Persian wars are ended, but their lessons are eternal, and their echoes will resound as long as human beings gather in communities and dare to dream of justice, beauty, and truth. And so, in the gentle darkness that embraces all human endeavor, we close this ancient story, carrying with us the knowledge that though empires rise and fall, though the mighty are humbled and the humble are exalted, the fundamental questions of human existence remain constant, waiting for each new generation to discover their own answers in the crucible of their own experience.